The stagecoach bucked one last time, a final protest against the rutted track that passed for a road, and groaned to a halt. For a moment, the only sound was the jingle of the harness and the heaving breath of the horses, their coats dark with sweat under the Arizona sun. Dust, fine as red flour, settled on every surface, including the black bombazine of Eleanor Thompson's traveling dress. She had been wearing black for 2 years, ever since the fever took her husband, Robert, leaving her a widow at 22. Now, at 24, she felt 100 years old, and the grit in her teeth was just one more small misery. From her window, she saw Red Mesa. It was less a town and more a wound on the landscape, a haphazard collection of unpainted wooden buildings baking under a vast, indifferent sky. A wide, dusty street separated a saloon, from which the tinny clang of a piano already spilled, from a general store with a sagging porch. Further on, she could see the stark frame of a new church, its steeple a lonely finger pointing toward heaven, as if in accusation. This was to be her new life, a world away from the green, orderly hills of Pennsylvania. She had come here to teach the children of silver miners, to fill her empty days with purpose, to run from the ghost that haunted her quiet house back east. But looking at the raw, sun-bleached desolation of this place, she wondered if she had not just exchanged one ghost for 1,000 others. The driver, a man whose face was a road map of hard miles, wrenched open the door. "Welcome to the end of the line, ma'am," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Mind your step." Eleanor gathered her valise and descended, her boots sinking into the deep, soft dust. The heat was a physical blow, a solid wall of shimmering air that stole her breath. Men stopped what they were doing to watch her, weathered miners with calloused hands, lean cowboys with watchful eyes, their stares a mixture of curiosity and appraisal. She was an oddity, a woman alone, dressed in the somber finery of Eastern grief. She clutched her bag tighter and held her head high, just as her father had taught her. "You are a Thompson. Eleanor, we do not bow." She found the small clapboard house that came with her position. Just behind the one-room schoolhouse, it was sparse, furnished with only a bed, a table, and a pot-belly stove. But it was clean, for days. She threw herself into her work, scrubbing the floors, arranging the few books she had brought, preparing lessons on letters and sums for children she had yet to meet. She was determined to carve out a small piece of civilization in this wild place. She attended the Sunday service at the new church, her clear voice rising above the uncertain murmuring of the small congregation. She bought her supplies at the general store, nodding politely to the women who whispered behind their hands and the men who tipped their hats with a flicker of respect. She was the schoolmarm, a figure of propriety, a symbol of the better world they all hoped to build. She was playing a part, and for a little while, it almost felt real. The illusion shattered on a Tuesday. She was walking back from the store, a small sack of flour cradled in her arm, when she heard the shouting. It came from the direction of the saloon, a sound thick with whiskey and menace. A crowd had gathered, a tight knot of men whose laughter was sharp and cruel. Curiosity, against her better judgment, pulled her closer. She stayed on the far side of the street, partially hidden by a water trough, and peered at the scene. 4 cowboys, flushed with drink and emboldened by their numbers, had cornered a man against the saloon wall. He was Navajo. That much was clear from his high cheekbones, the straight line of his black hair, and the proud, unbroken way he held himself, even as a trickle of blood ran from the corner of his mouth. He was tall and powerfully built, his buckskin shirt torn at the shoulder, revealing skin the color of rich earth. He did not speak, did not cry out. His eyes, dark and fierce, moved from one tormentor to another, missing nothing. "He stole my horse," one of the cowboys yelled, shoving the man hard. "A dirty liar and a thief." The crowd muttered in agreement. They were ready to believe it. In Red Mesa, a man's horse was his life, and its theft was a hanging offense. The town's sheriff, A portly man named Reeves with a drooping mustache stood on the edge of the crowd, making no move to intervene. His authority here was a fragile thing, easily swept away by the tide of popular fury. Eleanor felt a cold knot of dread form in her stomach. This was not justice. This was a pack of wolves closing in. She saw one of the cowboys uncoil a rope from his saddle. The word hangman sliced through the hot afternoon air, and the crowd surged forward, their excitement turning ugly. She saw the Navajo man's eyes briefly flicker, not with fear, but with a profound, bottomless contempt. He was preparing to die. Something inside Eleanor snapped. It was the same quiet, unyielding stubbornness that had made her defy her grieving parents and travel 2,000 miles to a place she did not know. It was the part of her that Robert had loved, the part he called her righteous fire. Before she could think, before she could weigh the consequences, she was moving. She dropped her sack of flour, which burst in a white puff on the red dirt, and walked directly into the street. She did not run or shout. She simply walked, her back straight, her chin up, right toward the center of the mob. The men, surprised by this sudden apparition in black, fell silent and parted before her. She was like a ship cutting through a murky sea. She did not stop until she was standing between the cowboys and their prey. She turned to the man with the rope, a big red-faced brute with small, piggish eyes. "Put that away," she said. Her voice did not tremble. It was clear and cold as winter ice. He stared at her, dumbfounded. "Ma'am, this ain't your concern. This is town business." She gave him a look of such withering condescension that he actually took a step back. "I am the schoolteacher in this town," she declared, her voice ringing with an authority she did not feel. "My concern is the education of its children. What lesson do you think you are teaching them right now, that a man's life is worth no more than a bottle of whiskey and a loud accusation? That justice is found at the end of a rope thrown by a drunken mob?" "Sheriff Reeves," she said, turning her gaze on the lawman, who shuffled his feet uncomfortably. "Are you going to allow this to happen? Are you going to let these men appoint themselves judge and jury?" The sheriff cleared his throat, his face reddening. "Now, Miss Thompson, the man was accused of horse theft." "Accused," she shot back, "but not tried. Is that not how it works in a civilized society? Or have I come to a place where the law is whatever the loudest man says it is?" The crowd was silent, their bloodlust cooled by the unexpected chill of her words. They looked at each other, then at the sheriff, then back at this strange, brave woman from the east. She had shamed them, and they knew it. The big cowboy slowly, grudgingly, recoiled his rope. The mob began to break apart, the men drifting away in twos and threes, suddenly eager to be elsewhere. Eleanor stood her ground until only she and the Navajo man remained in the dusty circle. She finally allowed herself to look at him properly. He was still leaning against the wall, but he was watching her now, his expression unreadable. The cut on his lip had stopped bleeding, but his face was bruised and swollen. She took a hesitant step toward him. "Are you all right?" He did not answer. He just watched her, his gaze intense, probing. It made her feel as if he could see right through her dress, right through her skin, and into the lonely, frightened heart she kept so carefully hidden. She felt a blush creep up her neck, an unfamiliar heat that had nothing to do with the sun. "You are hurt," she said, stating the obvious. "Come with me. I have bandages and clean water at my house." She expected him to refuse, to melt back into the wilderness from which he had come. But after a long, silent moment, he gave a nearly imperceptible nod. He pushed himself off the wall and followed her, his stride long and silent, a shadow at her back. Inside her small house, the air was still and close. She motioned for him to sit at the table while she fetched her medical kit, a small box containing linen strips, carbolic salve, and a bottle of laudanum. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured water into a basin. She was intensely aware of his presence, of the raw, masculine energy he brought into her quiet, orderly space. It was like letting a hawk into a canary cage. She came back to the table and began to clean his wounds. She worked with a practiced efficiency she had learned while tending to Robert in his final days. Her touch was gentle but firm as she dabbed at the cut on his face and cleaned the scrapes on his knuckles. He sat perfectly still, not even flinching when the antiseptic stung his skin. He smelled of dust, sweat, and something else, something wild and elemental, like pine needles in open sky. They did not speak. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. She was acutely conscious of the texture of his skin beneath her fingertips, the heat radiating from his body. When she was finished, she began to wrap a clean strip of linen around his bruised hand. It was then that he finally spoke. His voice was a low rasp, rough like sand on rock. "You still a virgin?" The question landed in the quiet room like a thrown stone. Eleanor froze, her fingers tightening on the bandage. The blood rushed to her face, a hot, mortifying wave. Of all the things he could have said, this was the most unexpected, the most audacious. It was a deliberate violation of the boundaries between them, a crude test of her composure. Her first impulse was to slap him, to order him out of her house. Her second was to burst into tears. She did neither. She slowly lifted her head and met his gaze. His eyes were not mocking, not entirely. There was something else there, a flicker of raw curiosity, a challenge. He was a man who lived by different rules, who had no time for the delicate pretenses of her world. He was asking what she was, a fragile doll from the East or something more. She finished tying the bandage, her movements precise and deliberate. Anger warred with a strange, unnerving flutter in her chest. For the first time in 2 years, she felt something other than the dull ache of grief. She felt alive, and it was terrifying. She stood up and stepped back from the table, putting a safe distance between them. "That is none of your business," she said, her voice tight with indignation. He did not smile, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. He had his answer. And in that moment, a thin, invisible thread spooled out between the exiled warrior and the lonely schoolteacher, a connection as fragile and as dangerous as a strand of spider silk in a high wind. He did not leave. The morning sun sliced through the single window of her small house, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and the man sitting silently at her table. The stark light of day brought with it a cold, hard clarity. Eleanor Thompson, the respectable schoolmarm of Red Mesa, was harboring a fugitive, a man the town wanted to hang. She had spent a fitful night on a pallet of blankets on the floor, while he had taken the bed without argument, a silent acceptance of her offer. She had lain awake for hours, listening to the unfamiliar sound of a man's steady breathing in the darkness, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Her first thought was a practical one: food. She had little enough for herself, and now she had another mouth to feed. She moved about the small room with a forced quietness, slicing bread and frying bacon. The smell filled the cabin, a simple, domestic aroma that felt absurdly out of place given the circumstances. He ate what she gave him without a word, his eyes following her movements. She felt like a specimen under glass. Every nervous gesture, every trembling breath, catalogued and assessed by that unwavering gaze. The days settled into a tense, secret rhythm during the day. While she taught long division and proper penmanship to a half-dozen dusty children in the schoolhouse next door, he remained hidden in her home. He was a ghost in her life, a silent presence she was aware of through the thin wooden walls. She would leave him a bucket of water and a plate of food, and when she returned at dusk, the plate would be empty and he would be sitting in the chair or standing by the window, a statue cloaked in shadows. She lived in a state of constant, humming fear. Every knock on her door sent a jolt of ice through her veins. Every shout from the street made her stop breathing. The town was a low, simmering pot of resentment. Sheriff Reeves paid her a visit 2 days after the incident. He twisted his hat in his hands as he stood on her doorstep, his face a mixture of paternal concern and official duty. "Eleanor," he began, using her first name in a way that set her teeth on edge. "I wanted to thank you for what you did. You stopped things from getting ugly. But you also stirred up a hornet's nest. The men from the silver mine, they are not happy. They feel cheated of their justice." "It was not justice. Sheriff, it was a mob," she replied, keeping her voice even, her hands clasped tightly behind her back so he would not see them shake. He sighed, a weary sound. "Maybe so, but this is a hard place, and the lines get blurry. That Navajo, they say he is gone, vanished, but if he shows his face in Red Mesa again, I cannot protect him, and I would hate to see anyone else get caught in the middle." He looked at her pointedly, his meaning perfectly clear. She assured him she understood, that she wanted no trouble. She closed the door on his retreating back and leaned against it, her legs weak with relief and renewed fear. The sheriff suspected. He might not know for certain, but the seed of suspicion was planted. Her evenings with the man she knew only as the Navajo were a strange counterpoint to her days of fear. The silence between them slowly began to fill with words. His speech was clipped, economical, as if every word was a valuable commodity not to be wasted. It was during these quiet hours, as she changed the dressing on his hand by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, that his story began to emerge. Not in a flood, but in fragments, like shards of broken pottery. His name, he told her, was Tahan. The horse he had been accused of stealing had been his own, one of a dozen promised to him and other Navajo scouts by an army captain. They had guided a patrol through the canyons, risking their lives on the word of the United States government. The treaty was a lie. The captain and his promises disappeared, and the horses were sold to the cowboys at Red Mesa. Tahan had not been stealing. He had been trying to reclaim what was his. He had been betrayed. Hearing this, something settled in Eleanor's heart. The moral ambiguity that had plagued her vanished, replaced by a fierce, protective certainty. This was not a simple matter of harboring a criminal. This was a matter of right and wrong. Tahan was not a thief. He was a man who had been cheated and nearly murdered for seeking what was owed to him. Her secret, once a burden of fear, now felt like a righteous crusade. She found herself watching him, studying the proud set of his jaw, the deep, sorrowful wisdom in his eyes. He was a man who had lost his home, exiled from his people for reasons he would not speak of, and then betrayed by the very men he had agreed to help. Yet there was no self-pity in him, only a hard, resilient pride. The nightly ritual of tending to his wounds became their point of connection. Her initial clinical detachment had melted away, replaced by a gentle intimacy that both warmed and frightened her. She would clean the last of the cuts on his face, her fingers brushing against the rough stubble on his cheek. He would watch her, his expression unreadable, and she would feel that now familiar blush rise from her chest to her hairline. One night, after she had shared her meager supper of beans and cornbread with him, he looked at the empty plate and spoke a single word. "Ahi." It was soft, a low vibration in the quiet room. She looked at him, puzzled. "What does that mean?" "It means thank you," he said, meeting her eyes. It was the first time he had offered any sign of gratitude. The word, so simple, felt like a gift. It was a word from his world, a world she could not imagine, and he had given it to her. She found herself praying with a new kind of urgency. Kneeling by her bed in the darkness, she would speak to God, her words a tangled mess of fear, confusion, and a strange, burgeoning hope. She was a good Christian woman, a widow who honored the memory of her husband. She was breaking the law of man, and she feared the law of God. She was hiding a heathen, a savage in the eyes of her community. She was terrified of the damnation that surely awaited her. And yet, her heart told her that compassion could not be a sin, that saving a man's life, no matter his race or origin, was the most Christian act of all. Her inner world was a battleground, her faith and her feelings locked in a desperate struggle. A few nights later, she was mending a tear in her dress by the firelight. Tahan sat across the small room, sharpening a knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a soothing sound in the stillness. She was concentrating on her needlework, her brow furrowed, a loose strand of her auburn hair falling across her cheek. She pushed it back impatiently, her mind 1,000 miles away, wrestling with her sermons and her secrets. "Shaidu Nijoni," he said. The sound of his voice, speaking words she did not know, pulled her from her reverie. She looked up. He had stopped sharpening his knife. He was just looking at her, his dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. What she asked, her heart giving a little skip. He did not translate it right away. He just held her gaze for a long moment. It is what our men say, when the light finds what is beautiful. He looked from her face to the firelight caught in her hair. You are beautiful. This time the words did not shock her like his first, crude question had. They landed softly, settling deep inside her. It was not a flirtation or a challenge. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with the same quiet gravity with which he spoke of betrayal and loss. Robert had called her beautiful, of course, but his words had been part of a familiar courtship, a comfortable love. Tahan's words were different. He was seeing her not as a wife, or a widow, or a schoolmarm, but as a woman, bathed in firelight in a small, lonely house at the edge of the world. She could not speak. She could only look at him, her needle forgotten in her hand. The fear was still there, a cold stone in the pit of her stomach. The guilt still whispered to her in the darkest hours of the night. But in that moment, another feeling rose up, powerful and undeniable. For 2 years, she had been a ghost, moving through the motions of life, her heart encased in the ice of her grief. But now, sitting in a room with a dangerous stranger, with the whole town a potential threat outside her door, she felt a slow, painful, and exhilarating thaw. She was breaking every rule she had ever lived by, risking her reputation, her safety, her very soul, and she had never felt so completely, terrifyingly alive. The desert night pressed in on the small cabin, a vast and profound silence that made the 4 thin walls feel like the last outpost of humanity. Inside, the world had shrunk to the golden circle of light cast by the kerosene lamp on the table. The air was warm, smelling of dried herbs and the faint, clean scent of lye soap. Eleanor was tending to Tahan's hand, a ritual that had lost its medical necessity but had become the anchor of their evenings. The last of the scabs had healed, leaving behind pale new skin against the weathered bronze of his knuckles. Her movements were slow, deliberate, her touch a familiar comfort. She was applying a thin layer of salve, more out of habit than need, when his other hand came up and gently covered hers, stilling her motion. She lifted her eyes from her work to find him watching her. The lamplight carved deep shadows into the planes of his face, making his high cheekbones seem sharper, his eyes darker and more profound. He had been quiet all evening, a thoughtful stillness that was different from his usual stoic silence. It was the calm of a deep river before it reaches the rapids. He let the silence stretch, holding her gaze, letting her feel the weight of the unspoken things that had grown between them in this small, hidden space. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough murmur, the sound of gravel shifting in a dry wash. "You still a virgin?" The words, the very same words that had once mortified her, now landed in the quiet air with no shock at all. She did not flinch, did not pull her hand away. She simply met his gaze. The question was not a challenge this time, not a crude jab at her propriety. It was a genuine inquiry, laden with a kind of weary irony and a deep, surprising tenderness. He was not asking about her past. He was asking about her present. He was asking if the wall she kept so carefully built around her heart was still standing. A slow smile touched the corners of his mouth, a rare and beautiful thing that transformed his harsh features. It did not quite reach his eyes, but it softened the line of his lips. Not for long, darlin'. It was not a boast or a threat. It was a promise, a declaration. It was an acknowledgement of the powerful, undeniable current that had been pulling them together since the day she walked into a mob to save his life. It was the truth, spoken plainly and without artifice, in a world that was full of lies. This time, Eleanor did not run. She did not blush in anger or shame. She felt a slow, spreading warmth begin in her chest, a liquid heat that moved through her veins and made her feel weightless. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. It was her surrender. It was her confession. No, the wall was not standing. It had been crumbling for weeks, and now the last of its stones had fallen. He released her hand and leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. He saw the truth of her silent answer, and it seemed to unburden him of something he had carried for a long time. The space between them was no longer filled with tension and fear, but with a fragile, shimmering honesty. "Loneliness is a sharp stone," he said, his voice quiet. "You carry it in your pocket. Sometimes you forget it is there, and sometimes you press your hand against it just to feel something." She understood. She understood so completely that it ached. "I know that stone," she whispered, her voice husky. "My husband, Robert, he was a good man, kind, but he was from my world. We fit together like two pages in the same book. When he died, the book was torn. I was just a single page, with no story to belong to. The loneliness. It was a cold, empty house, every room full of silence." Tehan nodded slowly. "My people cast me out. I spoke against a raid that was foolish, a raid for pride, not for need. For this, they said I had a white man's tongue. They said I no longer had a Navajo heart." He looked down at his hands, the hands she had just tended. "They do not see me as a man. To the soldiers, I am a savage. To the miners, I am a thief. To my own people, I am a ghost. A man who belongs nowhere is not a man at all." His words struck a chord deep within her. She had been defined her whole life by her roles: daughter, wife, widow, schoolmarm. She had been placed in boxes, her life neatly labeled. But Tahan, he saw none of that. He saw the woman hiding behind the black dress, the lonely soul shivering in the cold, empty house of her grief. And she, in turn, saw the man behind the fearsome reputation, a man of honor, betrayed, a man of profound loyalty, left with no one to be loyal to. They were two exiles, each banished from their own world, who had found a strange and unexpected sanctuary in each other. She did not realize she was crying until he reached across the table and brushed a tear from her cheek with the pad of his thumb. His touch was rough, but incredibly gentle. It was the touch of a man who knew how to handle both a weapon and a wounded bird. She leaned into his touch, a silent plea. The rigid discipline that had governed her every action for 24 years simply dissolved. The sermons about piety, the strictures of a society that demanded she mourn demurely for the rest of her days, the fear of God's judgment, it all faded into meaningless whispers against the powerful, overwhelming truth of this moment. For the first time, she understood that love was not a tidy set of rules written in a holy book. It was wild and dangerous. It was a force of nature, like a flash flood in the desert, that could sweep away everything you thought you knew and carve a new path in the landscape of your soul. He stood, and without a word, drew her to her feet. He led her away from the table, away from the small circle of lamplight, into the shadows that filled the corners of the room. He did not kiss her. Instead, he simply held her, his arms wrapping around her with a strength that felt less like a cage and more like a fortress. She buried her face in his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him, the smell of wood smoke and sage and the clean, masculine scent of his skin. It was the scent of life, of survival, of the wild earth. She tilted her head back, and in the dimness, she could just make out the dark shape of his face. He lowered his head, and this time his lips found hers. It was not a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a kiss of deep, aching hunger, a kiss that spoke of long years of solitude and unspoken longing. It was desperate and honest and raw. It was the meeting of two immense solitudes, a collision of two worlds. She responded with a fervor that surprised her, her hands moving up to tangle in his thick, black hair. A fire she had thought long extinguished, buried under the cold ashes of grief, roared back to life within her. The familiar room, with its sparse furniture and orderly books, became a sacred, primitive space. Their connection was a silent language their bodies understood perfectly. A desperate, tender conversation between two souls who had been starving for the simple grace of human touch. It was a gentle discovery and a wild claiming, a quiet healing and a fierce awakening. In the deep, silent heart of the Arizona night, a widow from Pennsylvania and an exiled Navajo warrior found each other, and for a few precious hours. They were not a white woman and an Indian man. They were simply a man and a woman, erasing the borders of their worlds and the scars on their hearts. Later, lying in the darkness of the bed, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing beside her, Eleanor felt a profound and terrifying calm settle over her. She thought of the path she had taken, from a prim and proper life in the East to this small cabin, to this man's arms. Every step had been a step away from the world she knew. Tonight, she had not just taken another step, she had leapt across a canyon. There was no going back. She could never again be the woman she was, content to live within the lines drawn for her by others. She had chosen. She had chosen this man, this life, this dangerous and uncertain future. The fear was still there, a cold shadow at the edge of her newfound warmth, but it no longer had power over her. She had made her choice, and for the first time since Robert's death, she felt a sense of peace. She had followed her own heart, and it had led her here. She was on a road with no map, heading toward an unknown horizon, and she was not afraid. The fragile peace of their shared dawn was the first casualty. The new world they had built in the shadows of the cabin could not withstand the harsh light of a suspicious town. The change was subtle at first, a slight cooling in the air when Eleanor went to the general store. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor's wife, who had once been so eager for town gossip, now busied herself arranging tins on a shelf, answering Eleanor's questions with clipped, single words. The women she passed on the street, who had previously offered polite nods, now gathered their skirts a little closer, their whispers ceasing the moment she drew near, only to resume the second she had passed. The children in her schoolhouse were more open, their innocence a cruel mirror of their parents' prejudice. One little boy, the son of a miner, asked her point blank, "My PA says you are keeping a redskin in your house. Is it true?" She had managed a calm denial, her heart hammering against her ribs. But she knew the secret was unraveling. Their sanctuary had become a cage, and the bars were closing in. Tahan saw it in her face when she returned home each evening, in the new tension in her shoulders and the haunted look in her eyes. He began to prepare. He packed a small bundle with the jerky she had bought, a water skin, and her medical kit. He kept his knife always within reach. He spent hours watching the town from the sliver of visibility the window allowed. His stillness that of a predator, coiled and ready. "They will come," he said one evening, his voice a flat statement of fact. "They are dogs that have the scent. They will not stop until they have cornered their prey." "What will we do?" she whispered, the question a knot of fear in her throat. "When they come," he said, turning from the window to look at her, his eyes dark and serious, "you will do exactly as I say. There will be no time for fear." The time came 3 days later, in the late afternoon. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Tahan heard them first. It was not a sound so much as a vibration in the earth, the purposeful tread of many angry men. He moved to the door, placing his ear against the rough wood. "Reeves is with them," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Go to the back window, now." A heavy fist pounded on the door. Eleanor Thompson, open this door. This is Sheriff Reeves." Her blood ran cold. She stood frozen in the middle of the room, her world shrinking to the sound of that voice and the splintering wood of the door. Tahan grabbed her arm, his grip hard and grounding. His eyes burned into hers. "Now," he commanded. The word broke her paralysis. She scrambled to the back of the cabin, her hands fumbling with the latch on the small window. "Outside," the sheriff's voice rose again, this time with less patience. "I know you are in there, and I have a warrant to search this property. Do not make this harder than it needs to be." Tahan was behind her. He pushed the window open and vaulted through, landing with a silent grace in the dusty yard behind the cabin. He turned and held out his hands. "Come, there is no other way." She could hear the groan of the front door beginning to give way under the force of a man's shoulder. She hiked up her skirts, placed her hands in his, and tumbled awkwardly out the window. His strong arms caught her, setting her on her feet. "Run!" he hissed, "and do not look back." They fled into the deepening twilight, melting into the landscape of scrub brush and cactus that began at the edge of the town. Behind them, they heard a triumphant shout as the door to the cabin finally burst open. It was followed by a roar of anger as the men realized their quarry was gone. A gunshot split the evening air, the bullet whining harmlessly over their heads. It was not a warning. It was a declaration of war. They ran until Eleanor's lungs were on fire and her legs felt like lead. Tahan, his pace seemingly effortless, pulled her along, his knowledge of the terrain their only shield. He led them through dry washes and rocky arroyos that hid them from view, always moving away from the town, deeper into the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the desert. Night fell completely, a blanket of impenetrable blackness. They finally stopped in the shelter of a rock outcropping, collapsing to the ground, their breath coming in ragged gasps. For a long while, the only sound was the frantic beating of their own hearts and the lonely cry of a distant coyote. Eleanor had never felt so utterly lost, so stripped of everything that had once defined her life. Her home, her job, her reputation, all of it was gone, left behind in that small, violated cabin. All she had now was the man sitting beside her in the darkness and the clothes on her back. The next day brought the true meaning of their flight into terrifying focus. The sun rose with a brutal, white-hot intensity, bleaching the color from the sky and turning the ground into a furnace. There was no shade, no respite. The landscape was a hostile expanse of rock and sand, thorns and stone, and behind them, they knew, the pursuit was coming. Sheriff Reeves was not a man to give up easily. By midday, the wind began to rise. It started as a whisper, a sigh across the heated rocks, but it quickly grew into a persistent, howling moan. The sky to the west turned a sickly yellow. Tahan stopped, his head up, sniffing the air like an animal. "Sandstorm," he said, the single word heavy with menace. He pulled her toward a shallow ravine, a mere crease in the earth. "Down. We must be lower than the wind." The storm hit them with the force of a physical blow. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of screaming wind and stinging, blinding sand. It was impossible to see, to breathe, to think. The air was a thick, choking cloud of red dust that filled her mouth, her nose, her eyes. Tahan pulled her tight against him, shielding her face with his body, his form a solid anchor in the roaring chaos. She huddled in his embrace, terrified, as the desert tried to scour them from its face. The storm raged for what felt like an eternity, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it passed. They emerged, gasping and spitting dust, into a world transformed. The landscape was muted, softened. every surface covered in a fresh blanket of red sand. Their tracks were gone. For the moment, they were safe from their pursuers. But the storm had taken its own toll. Their water skin was half empty, the precious liquid gritty with sand. The next 2 days were a blur of torment. Thirst became a living entity, a clawing beast in Eleanor's throat. The sun was a relentless enemy. Her sensible Eastern walking shoes were shredded by the sharp rocks, and her dark dress was a cruel trap for the heat. Tahan seemed immune to the hardship, his movements economical, his face a grim mask of determination. But she could see the strain in the tight set of his jaw, the slight slump in his shoulders. He was pushing himself to his limit to keep them both alive. On the 3rd day, as they were scrambling down a steep, rocky incline, Tahan's foot slipped on a loose patch of shale. He fell heavily, his body twisting, his arm catching the full force of his weight against a jagged rock. A sharp cry of pain was torn from his lips, a sound more shocking to Eleanor than the sandstorm had been. She rushed to his side. A deep, ragged gash ran from his elbow to his wrist, and the bone of his forearm was pushed up at an unnatural angle. Blood, dark and thick, pulsed from the wound, staining the red dirt an even deeper crimson. He looked from his arm to her face, his eyes clouded with pain but still sharp, still commanding. "The bleeding," he gritted out through clenched teeth. "You must stop it." In that moment, their roles were reversed. The capable survivor was now the wounded, helpless man, and Eleanor, the sheltered schoolteacher, was his only hope. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her. But then she looked at his face, at the absolute trust in his eyes, and a strange calm descended. She had saved him once with her words. Now she would have to save him with her hands. She tore a long strip from her petticoat and, following his gasped instructions, fashioned a tight tourniquet above the wound. She cleaned the gash as best she could with the last of their clean water and a cloth from her medical kit. Setting the bone was a horrific, agonizing ordeal for them both. His muffled groan and the grating sound of bone on bone, a memory that would haunt her nightmares. He faded in and out of consciousness after that, his body racked with pain and a rising fever. He was no longer the guide. He was her patient, her charge. The desert was still their enemy, but now she had to face it alone. Survival became a series of desperate, focused tasks. Following Tahan's fevered whispers, she found a barrel cactus and, using his knife, hacked it open to get at the watery pulp inside. It was bitter, but it was moisture. He taught her how to recognize the tracks of a jackrabbit, how to construct a simple snare from a strip of her own hair and a bent twig. The first time she checked the trap and found a small, struggling animal. She felt a wave of nausea, but the sight of Tahan, his face flushed with fever, his lips cracked and dry, gave her a strength she did not know she possessed. She dispatched the rabbit quickly, her hands shaking, and then, following his instructions, skinned and cooked it over a tiny, smokeless fire made from dry creosote bush. The meat was tough and gamey, but it was sustenance. It was life. As she fed small pieces to Tahan, she looked down at her hands. They were scratched, blistered, and stained with dirt and blood. They were not the hands of a schoolmarm. They were the hands of a survivor. She was no longer just a woman who had run from her past. She was a woman fighting for a future that was inextricably bound to the wounded man lying beside her. They were hunted by men, battered by nature, and isolated by a world that would never understand them. But in that desolate wilderness, as she fought to keep the man she loved alive, Eleanor Thompson finally discovered who she truly was. For 2 days, Eleanor half carried and half dragged Tahan through the desolate landscape. His fever raged, and his broken arm, crudely splinted with branches from a skeletal Palo Verde tree, was a constant source of agony. He spoke in fits and starts, his mind wandering between the present and a past she could not fathom. In his delirium, he guided her, his instincts a deeper magic than his conscious thought. He spoke of a place his ancestors called the Canyon of Bones, a sacred labyrinth of rock where the spirits of ancient warriors slept. It was a place of shelter, he murmured, a place where they could rest. Following the faint directions of his fevered mind, she found it. The entrance was a narrow slit in a towering red rock mesa, almost invisible until they were upon it. Inside, the canyon walls soared hundreds of feet high, sculpted by millennia of wind and water into fantastic shapes that resembled bleached and broken ribs. The air was cool and still, the silence profound. It felt like a cathedral built by a forgotten god. In the center of the canyon floor, a tiny spring seeped from the rock, creating a small, miraculous pool of clear, cold water. It was sanctuary. For a full day, they rested. Eleanor drank deeply from the spring, the first clean water she had tasted in what felt like a lifetime. She bathed Tahan's hot skin, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips. The fever seemed to loosen its grip in the cool shade of the canyon, and for the first time in days, he slept a true, healing sleep. As she watched over him, a fragile hope began to bloom in her chest. Perhaps they had made it. Perhaps the desert had swallowed their trail, and they were truly safe. The hope was a fool's dream. Late in the afternoon of their second day, a sound echoed from the canyon entrance. It was the scrape of a horseshoe on rock. Tahan was awake instantly, his eyes clear and sharp despite his weakness. He pushed himself into a sitting position, his face a mask of grim resolve. He did not need to speak. She knew. They had been found. She scrambled to a vantage point behind a jumble of fallen boulders near the entrance. Peering through a small gap, Sheriff Reeves was there, and with him were a half-dozen men from the town, their faces hard and grim, rifles held at the ready. They were not a posse of the law. They were a hunting party that had finally cornered its prey. They did not enter the canyon but fanned out, taking positions, sealing the only exit. They were trapped. Sheriff Reeves's voice boomed into the canyon, the rock walls amplifying his words into a soulless command. Eleanor Thompson, we know you are in there. We have followed your tracks. It is over. Eleanor's heart felt like a cold stone in her chest. She looked back at Tahan. He had managed to get to his feet, leaning heavily against the canyon wall. His injured arm cradled against his body. His face showed no fear, only a profound weariness. The sheriff's voice came again, this time offering a sliver of false hope. A devil's bargain. Send out the Navajo. Give him to us, and you can walk away. I will tell them he forced you, that you were a hostage. No harm will come to you. Eleanor, I give you my word. His words laid her life bare. She stood at a precipice between two worlds. Behind her was Tahan, the embodiment of a love that was wild and true, a love that had shown her the woman she could be. Before her was the world of her birth, the world of law and order and Sunday sermons, a world that now demanded she betray the man who had awakened her soul in order to save her own skin. Justice and love, law and loyalty. The choice was absolute. Tahan began to move, shuffling weakly toward the canyon entrance. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice a raw panic. He stopped and looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a terrible, heartbreaking finality. He said, "Your world will forgive you. My world is already gone. There is no place for me. Eleanor, but you can still go home." He was going to give himself up. He was going to walk out into their guns to save her, to give her back the life she had thrown away for him. The thought was a physical blow, more painful than any wound. She saw her future in a sickening flash, a long, empty life of quiet shame, forever haunted by the memory of her own cowardice, forever knowing she had purchased her safety with the blood of the only man she had ever truly loved. No, the word was not spoken. It was a silent scream in her soul. She would not go back to that world. She would not let him make this sacrifice. In that instant, every doubt, every fear, every last vestige of the timid woman she had once been was burned away, leaving only the hard, unyielding certainty of her love. She reached into the medical kit she had carried all this way. Tucked beneath the bandages and salves was the small revolver Robert had insisted she keep for protection on the frontier. She had never fired it. Her hand closed around the cool metal grip. It felt impossibly heavy. Tahan took another step toward the light. She moved faster. She ran to him, placing herself between him and the entrance. She turned to face the line of armed men. The small revolver held steady in her two hands. The hammer pulled back with a loud, definitive click. The sound echoed in the canyon silence. Sheriff Reeves, who had been starting to step forward, froze. The men beside him stared in disbelief. They were not looking at the respectable schoolmarm anymore. They were looking at something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose. "Get away from him." "Eleanor," the sheriff warned, his voice tight with shock and anger. "Do not be a fool." She felt Tahan's hand on her shoulder, a weak but steadying presence. Her voice, when it came, was clear and strong, with no trace of a tremor. "If you want him," she called out, her words ringing against the stone walls, "you will have to come through me." For a long moment, nobody moved. It was a tableau of impossible choices under the vast Arizona sky. Then, as if on cue from some unseen stagehand, the wind began to pick up. The sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue, began to haze over with a familiar yellow tint. Another sandstorm was coming. Perhaps it was the shifting light or the rising tension, but one of the miners to Reeves's right grew impatient. He lifted his rifle. The movement broke the spell. The world erupted in a cacophony of thunder and gunpowder. Muzzle flashes were brief, angry stars in the swirling dust that was now beginning to pour into the canyon. Eleanor felt the kick of the revolver in her hand, a living thing bucking against her grip. She did not aim at a man. She aimed at the flashes of light, a desperate attempt to drive back the darkness that sought to consume them. The canyon became a vortex of chaos. The howling wind and the roar of gunfire blended into a single, terrifying sound. Stinging sand blinded everyone, turning the posse into a group of confused and frightened men, firing at shadows. Tahan, using his one good arm, pulled Eleanor back, deeper into the cover of the boulders, shielding her with his body. A bullet ricocheted off the rock near her head, showering her with stone splinters. Another tore through the fleshy part of Tahan's shoulder, and she felt his body jolt against hers, heard his sharp intake of breath. Through the maelstrom, she saw Sheriff Reeves stagger and fall to one knee, clutching his leg. The sight of their leader down, combined with the fury of the storm, broke the posse's will. They were miners, not soldiers. They fell back, disorganized, calling to one another through the gale, their retreat a chaotic scramble for safety. They vanished into the blinding wall of sand. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the fight was over. Silence returned, broken only by the mournful howl of the wind. They were alone. They had survived. Eleanor turned to Tahan. He was slumped against the rock, his face pale, his shirt soaked with a fresh, dark stain that was spreading with alarming speed. He had saved her again, shielding her from the bullets. They had escaped the posse, but they had not escaped death. It was still there with them, in the canyon, its cold breath on her neck. She looked at his new wound, at the blood welling up, and she knew this was a battle she could not win with a gun. This would be a fight waged with her hands, her wits, and every prayer she had left. She was no longer fighting a sheriff and his men. She was fighting God and death itself for the life of the man she loved. The world was a symphony of pain, and Eleanor was its sole conductor. The sandstorm had passed, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt like the earth was holding its breath. In the bruised twilight of the canyon of bones, she worked, The bullet was lodged deep in Tahan's shoulder, a venomous piece of lead that was poisoning him with every beat of his heart. She had no tools but his knife, her sewing needle, and a will of iron forged in the crucible of the last week. She built a small, hot fire, the flames licking at the blade of his knife until it glowed a dull, angry red. Tahan was barely conscious, his body slick with the sweat of a fever that was threatening to consume him. She poured the last of the laudanum, a pitifully small amount, between his lips, praying it would be enough to dull the edge of the agony to come. "I am sorry," she whispered, her voice a raw thing in the stillness. "Tahan, I am so sorry for this." He did not answer, but his good hand found hers, his grip surprisingly strong. It was all the permission she needed, with a steady hand that did not feel like her own. She probed the wound. The next 10 minutes were a descent into a hell of another's pain. She worked by feel, her fingers slick with his blood. Guided by a desperate, prayerful instinct, he did not scream. A single, guttural groan was torn from his chest when she finally found and pried out the misshapen piece of lead, a sound that would echo in her memory forever. She stitched the wound closed with thread pulled from the hem of her own ruined dress, her needle rising and falling in a gruesome parody of the needlepoint she had learned as a girl. She packed the wound with a poultice of herbs he had pointed out to her before the posse arrived, his last piece of instruction before the world had exploded. She used the last of their clean bandages. Then there was nothing left to do but wait and watch and fight the encroaching darkness with the sheer force of her will. For 3 days and 3 nights, she did not sleep. She sat by his side, bathing his face, forcing water past his lips, her own thirst a distant, unimportant ache. She talked to him constantly, her voice a low, steady murmur, telling him stories of the green hills of her home, of the books she had read, of the silly, trivial things that had once made up her life. She was a lifeline of sound in his sea of fevered silence, determined not to let him drift away. On the morning of the 4th day, the dawn came with a pale, ethereal light that seemed to wash the canyon clean. The fever broke, the sweat on his skin was cool, and his breathing, which had been shallow and ragged, deepened into the slow, even rhythm of true sleep. She finally allowed herself to rest, slumping against the rock beside him, her body a screaming chorus of exhaustion. He woke when the sun was high in the sky, a sliver of golden light finding its way to the canyon floor. His eyes, when they opened, were clear. He looked at his bandaged shoulder, then at his splinted arm, and finally, at her. He saw the grime on her face, the dark circles of exhaustion under her eyes, the raw, blistered state of her hands. He saw the woman who had pulled him back from the edge of the grave. She saw the question in his eyes, the silent, wondering gratitude. She leaned close, her lips near his ear, so the stone walls would not steal the words. Her voice was a soft, ragged whisper, a vow spoken in the heart of the wilderness. "I chose you," she said forever. He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping from the corner and tracing a clean path through the dust on his temple. His good hand found hers and held it. It was his only answer, and it was everything. They stayed in the canyon for another week, a pocket of stolen time while Tahan regained his strength. It was a strange, peaceful interlude. Eleanor hunted, her snares now more successful than not. He taught her which roots were safe to eat, how to read the signs of the animals, how to be silent and watchful, a creature of the desert rather than its victim. They were a world of two, their pasts burned away, their future an unwritten page. They knew they could not stay. Sooner or later, Reeves or his men would return. There was no place for them in that land, no corner of the territory where they would be safe. Tahan spoke of Sonora, in Mexico, a hard land, he said, but a place where a man could disappear. A place where a name and a past were burdens you could choose to set down. Their journey south was slow and arduous, a pilgrimage of pain and perseverance. Tahan was still weak, leaning on her for support, his pride a casualty of his survival. They traveled by night, using the stars as their guide, sleeping during the brutal heat of the day in whatever shelter they could find. They crossed the invisible line that separated the United States from Mexico without ceremony. There was no marker, no fence, only a subtle shift in the landscape. The saguaro cacti gave way to thorny ocotillo and the strange, swollen trunks of bujum trees. The air felt different, ancient and dry, full of stories in a language she did not know. They walked until they could walk no more, until they found a small, forgotten village nestled in the foothills of the Sierra Madre. It was a place of adobe houses the color of the earth, a single dusty street, and a small, whitewashed church with a silent, cracked bell. The people here were a mixture of Mexican and Opata blood, their faces etched with the hardships of sun and poverty. They were wary of the strangers. The tall, wounded Indian man with the shattered arm and the white woman with haunted eyes whose dress was in tatters. But Tahan and Eleanor had nothing to offer but themselves, and necessity made them bold. They had no money for food, no place to sleep. Tahan, despite his injuries, found work with a man who owned a few scrawny horses. His quiet, patient way with the animals was a language the owner understood better than words. He could gentle a frightened mare with a touch and a low murmur, his hands speaking a truth that transcended borders. Eleanor's path was harder. The women of the village watched her with suspicion. But then a child fell from a tree, his arm broken as badly as Tahan's had been. The boy's mother was hysterical, the village's resident healer a bundle of superstitions and ineffective chants. Eleanor, with Tahan translating her quiet instructions, stepped forward. She had learned from her grim work in the canyon. Her hands were steady as she set the small bone, her touch gentle as she fashioned a splint. She made a cool poultice for the swelling and showed the mother how to change it. It was a beginning. A few days later, another woman came to her, her baby burning with fever. Eleanor had no medicine, but she had the knowledge of her long vigil with Tahan. She bathed the child in cool water, showing the mother how to bring the fever down slowly, patiently. The baby lived. They were no longer just the strange outsiders. He became known as Tahan, the horse whisperer, the silent man who guarded the village's small herd. She was Elena, the quiet American woman with the healing hands. They were given a small, crumbling adobe house at the edge of the village, which they repaired together, their hands working in tandem to mix mud and straw, to patch the leaking roof. Slowly, imperceptibly, they were woven into the fabric of the village. An old woman would leave a basket of fresh tortillas on their doorstep. A man Tahan had helped would share a portion of his kill after a successful hunt. They learned to speak a halting Spanish, their mistakes met with gentle smiles instead of scorn. They were judged not by where they had come from or the color of their skin, but by the strength of their hands and the kindness in their hearts. Their journey, which had begun in an act of violence and what her world would have called sin, had led them here. They had been pursued and condemned, pushed to the very edge of existence. But in this poor, forgotten corner of the world, they had found not judgment, but acceptance, their love, born in secrets and forged in the crucible of the desert, had crossed a border not just on a map, but between two souls, here, under a foreign sun. It could finally, quietly, begin to grow. 7 years. The river did not count them. It only flowed, a constant soothing murmur that had become the soundtrack to Eleanor's new life. It moved past the small wooden house Tahan had built with his own hands, past the sturdy corral where he kept the horses he bred and trained, past the small, flourishing garden where she grew herbs for healing and vegetables for their table. 7 years had passed since they had stumbled out of the desert, ghosts of who they had once been, and found their way to this quiet, forgotten valley in the heart of Sonora. The adobe village was a memory, a stepping stone on their journey. They had stayed there for 2 years, long enough for Tahan's arm to heal completely, for his strength to return, for Elena the healer to become a quiet fixture in the community. But the village was still too close to the world they had fled. They had saved what little they earned, and when they had enough, they bought 2 strong mules and journeyed deeper south, following the river, until they found this place, a small patch of fertile land claimed by no one. Here, they had truly set down their burdens. Here, the world had forgotten them. Eleanor was no longer the frightened widow in a black dress. The sun and the honest work had weathered her skin to a healthy gold. Her hands, though often stained with dirt from her garden or the pungent juices of medicinal herbs, were deft and capable. She had become the unspoken doctor for the scattered ranchos and remote villages in a 50-mile radius. People would travel for days to seek her counsel, bringing their sick children, their injured husbands. They called her La Curandera Americana, the American healing woman. They did not ask about her past. They only knew that her touch was gentle and her knowledge was deep. Tahan was a man remade. The haunted, hunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, watchful peace. His work with horses was legendary in the region. Men who could not tame their own wild stallions would bring them to Tahan, and he would work with them not through force, but through a silent, intuitive understanding. He was a man of few words, his Spanish still heavily accented, but he was respected. He was the guardian of this small homestead, his presence a quiet warning to any bandits who might mistake their isolation for vulnerability. And then there was Anima. Their daughter was 5 years old, a perfect, beautiful fusion of their 2 worlds. She had Eleanor's fine auburn hair, but it was straight and thick like her father's. She had Tahan's dark, almond-shaped eyes that saw everything with a preternatural stillness, but they were flecked with the same amber gold as her mother's. She was fluent in a fluid, unthinking mixture of English, Spanish, and the Navajo words her father taught her in the evenings. She was a child of the river and the sun, as nimble and sure-footed as a mountain goat, her laughter the brightest sound in the valley. She was the living, breathing proof of their impossible love. Sometimes, travelers would pass through, traders on their way to the coast or prospectors chasing rumors of gold. They would stop for a night, grateful for a safe place to rest, for a hot meal and Eleanor's skill in tending to their trail-worn ailments. They brought with them stories from the north, from the world that was now as foreign to Eleanor as a distant star. They spoke of railroads cutting across the plains, of new boom towns and bloody battles. And sometimes they spoke of legends. One evening, a trader, a talkative man with a weathered face, was sharing a story he had heard in a cantina in Arizona. He spoke of a brave schoolteacher who had stood down a lynch mob to save an Indian warrior. The tale had grown with the telling. In his version, she had been a gunslinger in disguise, the warrior a wrongly accused chief. He said they had vanished into the desert, pursued by a whole company of cavalry, and had never been seen again. Some said they had died in the sandstorm that had covered their escape. Others said they had been taken by spirits into the sacred canyons. Eleanor listened, her hands busy mending a small tear in Anima's shirt, her face betraying nothing. Tahan sat across the fire, cleaning a bridle, his expression as impassive as stone. Anima watched the trader with her wide, serious eyes, not understanding the full import of the story, but sensing it was about people like her parents. When the trader finished, a note of awe in his voice, Eleanor simply smiled and offered him another tortilla. The legend of the White Doctor and her Navajo warrior was a ghost story, a campfire tale. The truth of it was sitting right there, quiet and beautifully ordinary, in a small house by a river in Mexico. That night, long after the trader was asleep in the lean-to, they kept for guests. Anima was helping her mother shell peas by the hearth. The firelight danced on her face, illuminating the earnest concentration in her expression as her small fingers worked the pods. She was quiet for a long time, and then she looked up at Eleanor, her dark eyes full of a child's simple, profound curiosity. "Mama," she said, her small voice clear in the quiet room, "was it hard to love someone like Papa?" The question was so direct, so honest, that it stole the breath from Eleanor's lungs. She stopped her work, the pea pods still in her lap. How could she explain it to this child, this perfect creation who had never known a world where her parents' love was a crime? How could she describe the terror and the blood, the judgment and the flight? She looked into the fire, and for a moment, she was not in her peaceful home. She was back in the dust of Red Mesa, standing before a mob of angry men. She was in the small cabin, her heart hammering as she tended to his wounds, the air thick with a terrifying and thrilling intimacy. She was in the desert, the sand stinging her face, thirst a claw in her throat. She was in the canyon of bones, the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils, the weight of a gun in her hands, his blood warm against her skin as he shielded her. She remembered kneeling by his side in the darkness, fighting a battle with death itself, her only weapon a desperate, ferocious love. She remembered the world that had condemned her, the God she had feared she was betraying, the woman she had been, who had died in that desert so that the woman she was now could be born. Hard. The word was a pebble against the mountain of what they had endured. It was an impossible, inadequate word. She turned her gaze from the fire and looked at her daughter. She saw Tahan's strength in the set of her small jaw and her own stubborn will in the light of her eyes. She reached out and brushed a stray strand of auburn hair from Anima's forehead. "The hardest thing I ever did," Eleanor said, her voice soft and steady, imbued with the weight of absolute truth, and the truest. Anima considered this for a moment, her child's mind processing the two powerful, competing ideas. She nodded slowly, accepting the answer as a fundamental law of her universe, like the flow of the river or the heat of the sun. Then she picked up another pea pod, her attention returning to her task. The moment passed, but for Eleanor, the question lingered. It had brought the past rushing back, not as a source of pain, but as a reminder of the price of her peace, and of the immeasurable value of the man who at that moment walked in from the darkness, his face breaking into a rare, soft smile as he saw his wife and his daughter waiting for him by the fire. The river had measured out another 20 years of their lives, each season a bead on a long, unbroken string. The small wooden house now stood weathered and silvered by the sun, embraced by the thick toe, gnarled arms of the cottonwood trees Tahan had planted as saplings. The garden was a lush tapestry of greens and vibrant blossoms, and the laughter of grandchildren now echoed in the valley. Children of their daughter Anima, who had married a quiet young man from a neighboring rancho. Anima, with her father's watchful eyes and her mother's healing hands, now lived just a few miles downriver, a constant, joyful presence in their lives. Eleanor, now in her early 50s, moved with the graceful economy of a woman who knew her own strength. Her hair was more silver than auburn, braided in a thick plait down her back. The lines on her face were a map of her life, etched not by bitterness, but by sun and laughter, and long hours of concentration over the sick and injured. She was the heart of the valley, a figure of quiet authority and boundless compassion. Tahan was a man who had the stillness of the ancient mountains. His hair was completely white, a stark and beautiful contrast to his dark, unwrinkled skin. His broken arm had healed with a slight crook, a permanent reminder of their flight, but his hands were as strong and gentle as ever on the reins of a horse. He and Eleanor had grown into each other, their long silences as full of meaning as any conversation, their bond a silent, unshakable foundation upon which they had built their world. One hot afternoon, a stranger rode into the valley. He was not a trader or a prospector. He was young, an American, with the earnest, searching eyes of a scholar and the sunburnt face of a man who had been on the road for a very long time. He said he was a writer. a collector of the true histories of the West before they faded into myth. He had come searching for the real story behind a legend he had been chasing for 2 years, from the ghost towns of Arizona to the dusty cantinas of northern Mexico. He was looking, he said, for the healer of Sonora and her warrior. They sat with him on their porch as the sun began to lower, sharing a cool drink of water from the well. The young man spoke with a reverent excitement, telling them of the legend they had become in the land they had fled. Their names were gone, polished away by time and retelling. They were simply the schoolteacher and the Navajo. Their story, he said, had become a defining myth of the frontier. It was told as a romance, a tragedy, a tale of defiance against a brutal world. In some versions, they were heroic outlaws. In others, they were saints. The one constant was the love between them, a love so powerful it had defied law, race, and even the desert itself. "The town of Red Mesa is gone," the young writer told them, his voice soft with awe. "The silver ran out 30 years ago. Nothing is left but a few ruined buildings and the wind, the names of the men who hunted you. Sheriff Reeves and the others, they are all forgotten. No one remembers them. But everyone," he leaned forward, his eyes shining, "everyone remembers you." Eleanor listened, her hands resting quietly in her lap. The story he told felt like it was about 2 other people, 2 strangers from a different lifetime. The girl who had faced down a mob, the woman who had performed desperate surgery by firelight, seemed a phantom of her youth. The legend was a simple, stark thing, a story of blood and sand, but her life, the real life she had lived, was so much more. It was the quiet mornings with Tahan, the feel of Anima's small hand in hers, the satisfaction of seeing a fever break or a wound heal cleanly. The legend was about a single act of defiance. Her life had been about the patient, daily, humble act of building a home. When the young man had finished, he looked at them expectantly, his notebook open, ready to capture their true words. Tahan simply nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement that offered nothing more. It was Eleanor who finally spoke. "A story is like a river," she said, her voice as smooth and steady as the water that flowed nearby. "It starts in one place, but as it travels, it picks up silt and changes color. The story you have heard is not untrue. It is just incomplete. The desert was not our enemy. It was the place that stripped us of everything we were not, so we could discover what we truly were. It was our salvation." The young man wrote furiously, trying to capture her words. He stayed for 3 days, and when he left, his notebook was full and his eyes held a new understanding. He had come seeking a legend of heroes, and he had found something quieter and infinitely more profound, a story of a long and abiding love. That evening, Eleanor and Tahan sat on the porch alone, watching the sun bleed across the western sky. The sky was the color of a blood orange, the mountains a deep purple silhouette. It was a fierce, beautiful sunset, the kind that reminded her of Arizona, of the time when every sunset had felt like a victory, a survival. Now, it was just peace. She thought of the young writer and the legend he was so captivated by. The world remembered their courage, the courage to fight, but the world could never know the greater courage that had come after the courage to heal, to build, to trust, to be happy, the courage to live a quiet life when their story had been so loud. She turned to Tahan, who was watching her, as he always was, his gaze as knowing and as constant as the northern star. She remembered the first time he had spoken a Navajo word to her in that tiny, lamp-lit cabin, a lifetime ago. "Shidu Nijoni, you are beautiful." He had seen a beauty in her she had never known was there. Now, looking at his beloved, weathered face, at the wisdom and peace in his dark eyes, she felt the same words rise in her heart, but their meaning had deepened and expanded over the decades to encompass their entire world. She reached out and laid her hand on his, Her voice was a soft whisper, not meant for any ears but his. She du Nijoni, Tahan. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. He did not need to ask what she meant. He knew. It was not about the lines on his face or the silver in his hair. It was a statement that encompassed everything. You are my home. You are my peace. You are the truest thing in my life. The desert had not forgotten them, and they had never forgotten what it had taught them, that the most courageous act of all is to love, not just against the world, but against the fear in your own heart, and to do so forever. Thank you so much for listening to our story tonight. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect, and do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.